Chapter 13 of the Octave of Claudius. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. The Octave of Claudius by Barry Payne. Chapter 13. After breakfast on Tuesday morning, Claudius took the morning papers out into the garden and stretched himself comfortably under the mulberry tree on the lawn to glance through them. He had had a long swim in the river before breakfast, and had eaten a breakfast that would not have discredited a criminal on the morning of his execution. As he lay there in a light flannel suit, with his pipe in his mouth and the Times open before him, he felt perfectly placid and contented. The day was glorious. In a few hours he would see Angela again, and be riding by her side. He was so absorbed in feeling that life was good that he could forget that for him it was so brief. He glanced up for the first time in his life over a report of the mining market. He wondered which out of the long list it was that Mr. Wycherley had been told to buy. His eye was attracted by the name Martenhuis Deep. That might be it, or might not. Possibly it was not even in that list at all. He flung the paper down and picked up another. He opened it casually, and once more the same name caught his eye. Martenhuis Deep. He noted that the shares were to be bought at 13/16. He recollected at the same time that he knew personally his father's broker. For a few minutes he lay back and reflected. Then he got up and walked briskly back into the hotel. He wrote a hurried note to the broker, asking him to purchase 4,000 Martenhuis Deep, and giving the name of his banker. He sent this off at once by a messenger to town. He had never transacted any business of the kind before. He was not even clear if his note was correct, and the commission would be executed, or if he had omitted any necessary formality. By the second post came a letter from Dr. Gabriel Lamb, written in a small, neat hand on thick white paper. It ran as follows: My dear Sandell, how on earth did you get the preposterous notion that I entered into our contract in a commercial spirit, and would be likely to close it for a consideration of 100 or more %? You really do me an injustice. Remember that you were positively reluctant to take the sum that you will fully earn. I had to satisfy my own conscience actually to insist. Should I, if I had been commercially minded, have spent £8,000 on what I might have obtained with equal ease for 800, or merely as a return for such poor hospitality and attention as I was able to show you, a consideration of no value whatever except for the pleasure of your company gave us? It is a pity, of course, that you have met her. You obviously have met her, you know. Under these circumstances, I waited to reply to your letter until I had once more thought the matter over. The notion had occurred to me that you might perhaps, in the event of that stroke of luck, be able to find and purchase a substitute. I had to decide whether I would accept a substitute. Speaking quite frankly, any young man of a normal type would, if I could only trust him, suit me just as well as yourself. But I am afraid that I cannot trust anyone as well as I trust you. Mind, I have nothing but the word of the other party to the contract. He has but to break his word, and he can go. I have no legal hold. For the matter of that, you have only to break your word. You are not watched. I do not know whether you have left London for Guilbridge in order to be with her, or in order to avoid her. I think the former, and hope the latter. Even if I had you watched, I should have no power to compel you to come to me next Saturday at midnight, and to be mine to do as I please with. It remains with you. If you break your word, you will not come. Otherwise, only the death of one or other of us will end the contract. I need not point out again that murder or suicide would have for you, in addition to the conventional objections, the objection that either act would be dishonorable. But although I can hold out no hope to you, the enthusiasm of my work, which requires you, is stronger than myself. I can honestly sympathize with you. You entered into that agreement when you had no motive for living. You have now found the motive. It is possible that within the few remaining days you may have that motive strengthened. Possible even that you may find yourself in a position to offer me absurd sums to free you, as you suggest. This will make you feel bitter against what the storyteller calls fate, and though unjustly, bitter against me. Believe me, my dear Sandell, the best romance is the briefest. Though I am acting in the interests of my work, and without the least regard to your own private interests, I do you a service in saving you from satiety. Come away from life while it is still giving you youth and poetry and romance and possibilities. I myself should have left it long ago, had not my work detained me. It may interest you to hear that the bay mare, whose temper has daily grown more damnable, has killed the coachman. Did not you say that she would kill somebody? I have never driven her myself. My life is valuable to humanity. The coachman was not a perfect coachman, but his widow has already called twice at the house, apparently with no other motive than to tell me that he would have preferred to live, which I could have conjectured for myself, and to have hysterics on the doormat. We leave England next Sunday, and of course you with us. I've sold the house, and preparations for departure are already being made. If you happen to come across any really fine Madeira, would you let me know, or, better still, order 12 dozen to be packed for shipping and sent to me here. I have nearly finished my own wine, and my wine merchant seems to think that I will buy disease and disappointment at 120 the dozen. This is quite above the current market quotation for such commodities, as I have explained to him. I would pay double that to get exactly the wine I want. By the way, there is no earthly likelihood of your finding anything of the kind, but I thought I would mention it on the barest of chances, as you have a palate and understand my taste. If my wife were in the room, I'm sure she would join me in sending kind regards. Her health is at present a subject for the gravest anxiety. Au plaisir. Cordially yours, Gabriel Lamb. Claudius read this letter through twice and put it in his pocket. He walked up and down thinking about it. Certain phrases in it haunted him. His suspicions of the doctor came back with more force, and would not be dispelled. He had strange and horrible fears for the future before him. He could not put them from him till he was cantering over the turf with Angela beside him. Angela was not a very experienced horsewoman, but she was not nervous. A child would have been safe with the mare she was riding, perfectly made and as kind and easy as possible. In the exhilaration of the ride and the presence of Angela, the worst could be easily forgotten. From the heath their way led through a gate into a grassy lane with high hedges on either side. As they approached the gate at a walking pace, two youths, humorous louts apparently, shut the gate, latched it, and then ran off laughing down the lane. "Please wait here a moment," said Claudius to Angela quietly. He wheeled his horse round, and then put it at the gate. Over he went and down the lane after those louts. He returned in a minute, literally driving them before him, with a pleasant smile on his face. Men who smile pleasantly when they have lost their temper are mostly dangerous. Possibly the two louts knew this. Their choice lay between going back to the gate, being ridden down, and pulling Claudius off his horse. they decided to go back to the gate. "Open it," said Claudius curtly, "and hold it open until we're through." "It was only a joke," said one of them rather sheepishly as he pulled the gate back. "So's this," replied Claudius. "Don't let it go any further than that." Claudius rode up to Angela, laughing, and returned through the gate with her. His fit of temper had completely vanished. He flung a coin to the youths as they passed. "To show them that their civility will pay them better than their humour," he explained. "That was rather pretty," said Angela. "And rather silly, I'm afraid," said Claudius. "I don't know exactly why, but I feel a little like a circus rider in consequence. I expected a bad brass band to begin as I came down the lane, and was rather disappointed that it didn't." "Oh, no," Angela answered. "You were in a very bad temper. Many a poor child has had its pudding and its pocket money cut off for less. Leave me my pudding, and I will apologize. I've got the nastiest possible temper myself." "I can't pretend to believe it," said Claudius. "You ask too much. But look, here we are at the inn." Mrs. Wycherley had not yet arrived. Angela said that she would order tea while Claudius saw that the horses were properly looked after. They met in the garden of the inn, a picturesque garden, dotted about with tables and chairs and arbours. "Have you ordered a very good tea?" "Well," said Angela, "I've done my best." The place looked so tumbled down and old and out of the world that I had great expectations of it. I hoped that there would be a surly landlord who would say that he never had been asked for tea and wouldn't give us it. Then I should have persuaded him and bribed him, and helped to cut the bread and butter, and gradually he would have got to like us. "It's not impossible," said Claudius, "but the place is different, spoiled by the patronage of the tripper, ruined by civilization. I gave my orders to a trim little person in a clean London apron, with a lot of nasty little hotel ways. And there was a tariff, mark you, Mr. Sandell, a horrible fixed tariff, with 3 kinds of tea on it: plain tea, tea with eggs, and tea with meat. Tea with meat would be extravagant and ostentatious. If you have ordered that, I refuse to pay for my share, or to countenance it in any way except by eating it." But I didn't. Neither did I order the plain tea because it sounded dull, and also because I thought it would make the trim person think that we were not wealthy. I went in for the golden mean, which takes the form of eggs. "And where are we going to have the golden mean?" "Out here in the garden." I insisted on honey and cream. I prayed the trim person, if only for a few hours, to be as pastoral and unsophisticated as possible. And she said, "Oh, you'll find us quite punctual." So possibly she hasn't caught the spirit of the thing. Possibly not. Why this hunger and thirst after pastorality? "Because I'm in the country," she said impetuously. "Because all of a sudden I hate horrible, vulgar, complex, social, dirty, striving, mean London life. It has made me so bad, and I want to be better again. Oh, I'm much more in earnest than you think. Really I am. It's been coming upon me lately, and quite suddenly. I know it. I'm a changed girl." There was a whimsical smile on her face, but her eyes were serious and looking out for sympathy. "Yes, tell me all about it." "It would be a heavenly thing to confess everything. You confessed to me a little, didn't you, at our house the other night? I haven't been criminal in spots. No murders or burglaries or things of that kind. I've only been mildly always and altogether wrong. I believe I would have been good if the world and circumstances had not spoiled me. I was very vulgar in one way, and very angry with anybody who was very vulgar in the other way. I didn't know the right value of things. I ran after straws that were worth nothing. I see now that nothing's more vulgar than to think much about vulgarity and to use the word. This is subtle. Subtle? Ah, believe me, I'm fairly crying for simplicity. If I could get work as a dairymaid, not the stage dairymaid, but the real thing, I might save my soul alive. As it is, she made a movement with her hands to her throat, I'm choked in London. It's all one game of brag, silly, undignified brag. I've played at it, loathed it, and gone on playing it. Everyone tries for an effect, and most of them miss it, and are laughed at for their failure. And those who get it find that it is not worth getting. One manages and schemes and does humiliating things to secure what? Less than the fluff of that seeding dandelion? Is this all quite serious? Yes, if you like. It is the cynicism of extreme youth, and therefore counts for nothing. But it's not assumed at any rate. I'm being very honest this afternoon. With the arrival of Mrs. Wycherley and tea, Angela suddenly changed her tone. She was no longer mournful. Her eyes brightened. Her talk was full of the brightest and maddest raillery. But as Claudius and she rode back again, she as suddenly became very quiet. They had ridden for some time side by side without a word when Angela raised her head and said, "Mr. Sandell, what are you thinking about? I had the presumption to be thinking about you. What are you thinking about me? That you have as many moods as an April day? Do you mind? I would have nothing altered. You enter into all my moods. When I am in good spirits, you are in good spirits too. How can you do it with the end so near for you? I think I shall ask you to tell me the rest of your story very soon. I have not forgotten it." There was a pause, and then she added, "I am in a sad mood now." Their eyes met, and she read the sympathy that he did not speak. He found himself wishing that the ride might last forever, on and on in a perpetual quiet summer afternoon. He desired nothing better than the strange exaltation that he felt just now. The ride lasted exactly until 6:30. Angela praised Jenny, the mare, that she had been riding. She thanked Claudius. "You must ride her again if you like her," said Claudius. "She's an adorable beauty, and too good for me, perhaps. And thank you again, Mr. Sandell. Goodbye." Even as he left her, he knew that he was to see her again that night. He felt sure of it. After dinner, he strolled out onto the heath. It was growing dark, and the twilight was cool and fascinating. He was not surprised to see her standing silhouetted against the sky, a slender gray figure. Nor did she seem surprised as she turned and saw him. "Are you not afraid to be out alone?" "No, no, thank you. When we are in the country, I often do this. Mamma writes one letter, and then goes to bed early, and I, if I'm restless, walk on till I'm tired. See, I have my own key. Would you rather be by yourself, Mrs. Wycherley, or may I? If you would walk with me and tell me the rest now, the rest of the story." He began at once. He told the story as briefly as possible, wasting no word on apologies for telling it. He told how, an outcast from his own home, a failure in the work he had attempted, with no tie to life and no motive for living, worn out by privations and disappointment, he had been found by Dr. Gabriel Lamb. He dwelt at length on the kindness of the doctor and his wife, and tried to indicate the character of the man. He described how the agreement came to be made, and told the precise terms of it. "Thank you for telling me," she said quietly, when he had finished. "It's worse than I had feared. If there's no other way, can he not be bought? I thought of that only yesterday. I wrote and asked him." Early this morning I ventured on a mining speculation. Your father had spoken of such things the night before. I do not care in the least for gambling of any kind. It doesn't amuse me. I know nothing whatever of the shares I have bought, except their name and present price. I somehow felt sure, it was a silly presentiment, but a strong one, that I was right, and that I should make a profit large enough to buy my release. I had hardly sent off the order to the broker before the second post came in. The doctor refuses to cancel the agreement for any money consideration whatever. I believe that he really does not care for money in the least, or for anything very much except his work. Is the name of the mine Martin House Deep? Yes. Why? How do you know? Because as we were coming here yesterday, Papa asked me jokingly if I should like him to make a fortune. He said he could make one in less than a week by buying Martin House Deep, but that he wouldn't do it because it was outside his legitimate business. As you were speaking, the name flashed into my memory again. Wait, there's another thing I want to ask you. Will you let me see the manuscript of your novel? I would, but I've sent it off to another publisher. Why? Why, she exclaimed impatiently, did you not do that before the agreement? The book had been refused twice, and I was quite hopeless about it. But if I had known the agreement was coming, I think I should have tried again first. I did not know. It came suddenly. Time was apparently of great importance to the doctor, and he would not have waited for the publisher's decision. Then I was under great obligations to him. He had saved my life, clothed me, fed me, treated me with the most delicate kindness and perfect trust. By accepting, I repaid him. If I refused, I saw nothing before me. It is too soon to say yet, but if everything came now in these few days, now when it's too late, that would be terrible. Do not be angry with me, Mr. Sandell, for what I'm going to say. You tell me that the doctor has no legal hold on you. I think he has no moral hold, that he is not acting in good faith. Have you thought of the possibility of breaking your word? I am not angry with you, said Claudius, with a dreary smile. I'm no better than other men, and I've thought of it. If I did it, I dare say for a few days I should feel nothing but relief, freedom, pleasure. The other thing would come, though. I should feel that I had broken my promise, betrayed a man who trusted me. I should feel that I had done it through cowardice. It would not be possible to live like that. Perhaps it would be easier to break my word if he had a legal hold upon me, if I ran the least risk in breaking it, if it were not mere cowardice. Yes, I see, said Angela. I had not guessed what the story would be, and very often, when I had been laughing and generally silly, you must have hated it and thought me unsympathetic. You know, when you were at your house, I gave you my sympathy, and I meant it. Only I did not know that it was quite so horrible, or quite so hopeless then, or so sometimes. Ah, do not alter. Let me be happy for the little time that is left. Angela laughed a little mirthless laugh. I feel, she said, as if I had been playing the fool at a funeral. No. If you must reproach anyone, reproach me for having done a reckless and suicidal thing, and for having distressed you by telling you about it. I have told no one else. I wanted you to tell me about it. I would not have that different. Will you please let me go home alone, Mr. Sandell? Now, please. Good night. Her small, cold hand touched his a moment, and she had turned and gone. As he stood still, watching her as she walked away, he heard through the still night a faint sound. and knew that she was sobbing. He went back to the hotel, cursing himself for all he told her, cursing that excellent Lady Verrider for her well-meant advice that had led him to do it. He spent a wretched and sleepless night. In the letter which Mrs. Wycherley wrote to her husband, she said, "Angela has gone for one of her favourite evening strolls, just after dinner, but the young never think of these things. A good daughter she always was, but really she improves. Never corrects me now if I do or say anything that isn't quite as it should be. Less strict she seems to be, and fonder. We have much to be thankful for. Not one touch or one twinge since I've been here. Country air and plain food account for it. The cooking is good here, with the exception of the gravies. No richness or strength in them. But I've not spoken about it yet." End of Chapter 13. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 14 of the Octave of Claudius. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. The Octave of Claudius by Barry Payne. Chapter 14. Wednesday morning brought 2 letters for Claudius. One of them was merely the contract note for 4,000 Martinhouse Deep, purchased at 13/16. In the report in the morning paper, Claudius read, "The chief feature in the mining market was the demand for Martinhouse Deep on Paris buying. After quickly springing to 2 5/8, there was a slight relapse, owing to profit-taking. This, however, was nearly recovered in the street, the last price reaching 2.5. Claudius had thought of wiring to Mr. Wycherley to ask whether he should sell or hold. Then he decided for himself to hold, and leave it to luck. Whether he won or lost could not matter to him now. His other letter was a friendly and informal note from the senior partner in the publishing firm to which he had sent his novel. "It is not a common thing," wrote Mr. Aragon, "for a novel to be sent us on Monday and accepted on Tuesday. That, however, is the case with your book. On Monday afternoon, I happened to want something to read in the carriage as I drove home from business, and picked up the first few pages of your novel. There were several manuscripts on the table waiting to be sent off to my reader. It is seldom that I read anything myself, and it was the merest chance that I picked up part of your book rather than one of the others. Well, I read these few pages on my way home, and as soon as I got there, I sent the carriage back again for the rest of it. I finished it after dinner. That was quite enough to decide me. If the book took hold of me like that, and I'm fairly hardened, it is certain to interest others. We shall be very glad to publish it." The terms offered were fair and businesslike, neither unjust nor wildly generous. Claudius wrote to thank Mr. Aragon and accept them. That also could not matter to him now, save that it added to the irony and bitterness of the fate that held and mocked him. He sent round a note to Mrs. Wycherley, offering her his carriage. Jeanie, too, was at Miss Wycherley's disposal, if she preferred to ride. He waited impatiently for the reply. He picked up a book and tried to read, then found that he was turning the pages mechanically without being in the least conscious of what he was reading. He flung the book down and went out into the road, pacing up and down impatiently. It seemed as if the messenger would never come. He came in sight at last, sauntering leisurely along until he saw Claudius. The note that he brought was from Mrs. Wycherley. It was brief. It thanked Mr. Sandell very much for his kindness, but neither she nor her daughter would ride or drive that day. It gave no reason, and suggested no meeting. Claudius at once read into that letter more than poor Mrs. Wycherley had ever intended to put there. It vexed him with a certainty that there was something behind, and an uncertainty what that something was. It seemed cold. Was Angela ill? Mrs. Wycherley distrustful? What could it be? To remain still was impossible. He had his horse brought round and started out. He rode past the house where Mrs. Wycherley and Angela were lodging. He had some faint hope that they might come out or in as he passed, that if only for a moment he might speak to Angela. He saw nothing of them. He noticed, though, that the blinds were drawn in the upstairs rooms. Again the fear came to him that Angela might be ill. His mind was a torture chamber. Anxiety for her, self-reproach, impotent rage at his fate, burning and stifled passion goaded and maddened him. The octave was drawing near to its end, and the hours were flying, wasted away, wasted without Angela. He turned onto the heath, and rode as a man rides who would fain get away from himself, from his own thoughts. It was 3 o'clock when he returned. He had come back by the same way he went. Once more he had failed to see Angela. Once more he had noted the drawn blinds. At 4 o'clock he could endure it no longer. He had decided to call at the house, expecting only to be refused admission. But Mrs. Wycherley was at home. She was in the garden. If he would walk through the house, he would find her there. He found her seated in the shade, in an easy-chair propped up with cushions that she took with her when she went away from home. She looked benevolent. She was reading a shilling paper-covered book that she had purchased at the station bookstall. Dainty dishes, how to cook and how to serve them. It might give me some ideas, she had said to Angela. She laid aside the book, with the title downwards, as she saw Claudius. "Now, this is very kind of you," said Mrs. Wycherley, "not to have got tired of us." Claudius looked for satire in her voice or expression, and found none. "It was so good of you to send round this morning, too," Mrs. Wycherley continued. "But Angela seemed so tired. No, not ill, merely tired. I thought a quiet day would be the best thing for her. They're bringing you a chair, aren't they?" "Yes, I see, that's right. Oh, Angela, yes, I was speaking about her. A short walk. That really has been all we have done. In this heat, you see, everything is so hot, and that induces lassitude. Angela, in fact, is lying down upstairs now. I insisted upon it. I ought to have proposed the river this morning. It would have been cool there. For Angela, yes. For me, I'm afraid it would not do. I suppose I am a curiously constructed person, but the rocking of the boat sadly interferes with my being perfectly well. As my doctor once said to me, putting it as I thought very neatly, 'You have not,' he said, 'got a delicate constitution, but you have got a sensitive constitution.' Angela is not a sufferer at all. She adores the river. Now, to my mind, there's nothing pleasanter than to be driven through beautiful green country in a comfortable carriage. That drive to deep water and back really did me good. You must try it again." Claudius spoke at intervals, as her babble demanded it of his civility. All the time he was looking towards the house. And Angela came at last, contemporaneously with the tea-things. She stepped slowly through the French windows, and down the lawn towards him. She walked gracefully, her head thrown back. She was pale, and dark under the eyes. Her expression was one of patience, new to her, wonderfully appealing. She shook hands hurriedly with Claudius, and busied herself with the teacups. "I'm sorry to hear that I tired you out yesterday, Miss Wycherley," said Claudius. She smiled and shook her head. "I wasn't tired, and you didn't do it if I was. And besides, I got over it, modelled on the housemaid's excuse for the broken vase." She seemed afraid to meet his eyes. In her manner she was strangely shy. "And I had meant to tire you out again tomorrow," he said. "I thought the river—" "Ah, the river! I love it. But, mamma—" Mrs. Wycherley would not hear of that objection. "We might arrange something," she said. She had just been reading in that yellow-covered book a descriptive passage entitled "The Picnic Pie." A picnic was in her mind. Her imagination built up a lovely entertainment, with the pie as its chief cornerstone, and seated her on emerald moss under an azure sky. Angela refused the suggestion of a picnic. "Unless you leave the picnic part out," she added, "I don't mind the sward so much, but I dislike the sandwiches. Then there's bother and discomfort, and one always tears one's dress," she sighed. "Give me peace at a public house," she said earnestly. Claudius laughed. Mrs. Wycherley said that Angela was really too shocking. "But the idea is excellent, Mrs. Wycherley. We go by the river to the inn at Deepwater. You go in the carriage and meet us there. Then luncheon, peace, and a public house." That was settled. Soon after Claudius left, with some at least of his troubles over. Mrs. Wycherley and Angela were not angry with him for anything. Angela was not ill. He would be alone with her on the morrow. All that was good, but each time that he saw Angela made it harder to part with her, and harder to love in silence. That night Mrs. Lamb dined downstairs with her husband. She said that she felt better and she looked better, though the extreme pallor of her face was still noticeable. Her eyes were restless and unsteady, and she was very talkative. Throughout dinner he took his own part in the conversation, genially enough, admired her dress, told her a good story or two, and answered readily her questions as to their departure from England. As dinner progressed, she seemed to grow rather more excited, and as soon as the servants had gone, she turned abruptly to the doctor and said, "I want to be forgiven, Gabriel." He looked critically at her and did not answer. She avoided his gaze and rambled on, speaking vaguely at times, almost incoherently. She wanted to be forgiven. She had saved him from himself, or believed she had, and he knew nothing about it. She said that she had felt that she had to tell the truth now, and that she was compelled to say that she hated him, but she had saved him from himself all the same. She knew he was clever, but it was better to be good, and she was trying to be good again. He might trust her. Dr. Lamb gave a long, slow yawn. "This," he said, "is becoming tiresome, Hilda. However, as you insist, I will go through it all once, quite plainly, and get it over. You should not try to be mysterious with me, for you are not good at mystery. You have said more than once that you want me to forgive you. You do not tell me why. I cannot. I can tell you, though." "No, no," she cried. "I will not hear it. You will understand your position and mine better if you hear it. You want me to forgive you for your desire to be a much worse woman than you will ever have the chance to be." Claudius Sandell. She rose, gasping, looking round her with agonized eyes. She took 2 or 3 steps to the window. A heavy curtain was drawn over it. She stood there with her back to the doctor, holding on to the curtains with both hands, her white face pressed against its folds. "Claudius Sandell does not and never will love you. You are saved from being bad by being, pardon me, insufficiently attractive. Even if he cared for you, it would make no difference, because he is an honorable man, and also, but I need not go into that. Your own position is, therefore, contemptible, and my position is perfectly secure. His position, by the way, is unfortunate. I had a letter from him the other day, from which I understand that there is another woman. Hopeless, of course. As I have not quite finished, I would suggest that you should sit down. Standing will tire you." She sat down, covering her face with her hands. I passed to the next point. "You say that you saved me from myself." A pulpit phrase, I should imagine. Strange that, though you have suddenly passed from a somewhat crude religion to a somewhat crude atheism, you still use the phrases of the religion. If you mean that you have written to Sir Constantine Sandell, I am perfectly well aware of it. Could have easily stopped it, but did not care enough about it. Your letter may bring about a reconciliation between father and son, but that will not prevent Claudius Sandell from keeping his word and returning here, and it will not alter my subsequent treatment of him. Your guess as to what that will be is, roughly speaking, correct. It will turn Miss Matilda Comby a fraud, but your sister out of a very comfortable berth, and make Sir Constantine miserable. Nothing more than that. Lastly, you say that you hate me. I pass over the impropriety of it. I merely ask you to consider the possibility that the fact, if it is a fact, though apparently of great interest to you, may not be of the least interest to me. Have I made myself clear?" She nodded her head. "Then we need not refer to these matters again. That will be in every way better. I am exceedingly sorry to use language to you which is positively rude, and excitement is very bad for you. After tonight, there need be no occasion for either. As to your future conduct, I should prefer that you did not tell me I was clever, and also that you did not treat me as if I were a fool. That is to say, do not plot, be mysterious, or undertake the guidance of my actions, especially where my work is concerned. Always speak to me as if there were a servant in the room. Great though my contempt is for every individual, including myself, I find that my tastes can be best disregarded when they are entirely satisfied, and my tastes are not in favour of Clapham Villa squabbles with you. I cling, positively cling, to the conventionalities of decent life. There are many men in my place who would have killed you or tried to divorce you. I myself gave you a certain remedial punishment that you have not forgotten. But violence and scandals, though violence was necessary in that instance, offend my love of conventionality. I only ask to live, until your day comes, as almost every man of the world lives, on perfectly friendly and civil terms with a woman in whom he has ceased to be interested. You understand? Is there anything you would like to ask?" Hilda Lamb slowly raised her head. Her fit of excitement and volubility had passed. She looked beaten and suffering. There was blood on her lower lip where she had bitten it. "Ah, God!" she wailed. "If I could only die tonight!" Once more she rose and paced up and down the room. Then she stopped and said, "Am I free to do what I like, to write letters if I like? Are you having me watched? How could you suspect me of such abominable vulgarity? Of course you're free, and of course you're not watched. By all means, write your letter to Scotland Yard to say that your husband intends to murder Claudius Sandell, and has told you so, and will Scotland Yard please come and stop it? If you succeed in making your story sufficiently probable to induce the police to investigate it, which I do not for one moment think, the police will discover that I am about to employ an amanuensis, a Mr. Sandell, as my poor afflicted wife is no longer able to help me." "Yes," she said drearily, I believe that I'm going mad. Sometimes I'm mad already. I could do nothing. But I was right then, and it will be murder." "My dear child," said the doctor, "we do not use these coarse, crude, inappropriate terms. That word mad, for instance. Consider, rather, that you are in a state of unstable equilibrium. I apply a certain force. Notice, to the saucer of my coffee cup. It moves slightly, but returns to its original position. Its equilibrium is stable. The same force or stress applied to this wine glass would knock it over and break it. Its equilibrium is unstable. You must guard against stress, against excitement. Avoid violent emotion of any kind. There is no occasion to think or speak of madness. As for the other word, equally melodramatic, murder, it is out of place, supposing that an experiment ends in death. In this case, death merely means the conclusion of a commercial transaction. I might also point out that the loss of life to one individual is nothing as compared with the gain to the race. But I know that you do not take these broad views. Say to yourself that Claudius Sandell has, for a consideration, agreed to help me verify much which at present is merely theory, and that you hope all will be satisfactory. Be optimistic, be euphemistic, and you may yet be happy." Mrs. Lamb half closed her eyes. "Gabriel," she said, Did Mr. Sandell know about me? About the tacit but unfortunate compliment you paid him? He did not, and I should not tell him." "Can you tell me the name of the other woman?" "I do not know it, but in any case he must leave her on Saturday, and he will not see her again. She does not concern any of us." "Gabriel, one cannot help thoughts and feeling. One can only try to check them, and at first, when I could pray, I did." He made a little impatient gesture. She went on. "I have not said or done anything wrong. The rest I could not help, and perhaps if you had gone on loving me, or if my baby had not died, it would not have happened. But you are my husband, and you pay everything for me, so it was wicked, and so I asked you to forgive me, and now I want to ask you a favor." "Well?" She asked very slowly. "Let Mr. Sandell go, and use me instead. I can bear things, and I would not let any one suspect, and I should be glad to die." "Do you think it probable," the doctor asked, "that I should allow you the exquisite pleasure of dying for him? Surely it is not to me that you should offer evidence of such devotion. But in no case could I have thought of it, as you are not suitable, not what I want. Is there anything else that you want to ask? No?" He gave a deep sigh of relief. "That is capital. We have been through it all, and got it over. It is 9:30, and you should get as much sleep as possible." Mrs. Lamb rose obediently. "And after this, no more scenes. We meet tomorrow on ordinary terms, the most ordinary possible, perfectly ordinary. Good night, Hilda." He opened the door for her, and she passed out. He sat down again, lit a cigar, and smiling. He sat there smoking. He made two observations. The first was typical. That connection between religion, self-sacrifice, and the sexual instinct. The second was, wonder why I told her to avoid excitement and not think about her mental state. Professional habit, I suppose. End of chapter 14. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 15 of the Octave of Claudius. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. The Octave of Claudius by Barry Payne. Chapter 15. Mrs. Wycherley supposed that it must have been in consequence of her sitting out in the garden. She did not see how it could have been that. But at the same time, if it was not that, what else could it have been? Anyway, there it was, a slight chill, not so much a cold, she explained, as the beginning of a cold. Deal with these things promptly, she said to Claudius, and you get them over in a day. Keep indoors, and in one room as much as possible. Spirits of camphor, light diet, and a little champagne in the evening. That is my rule, and I do not know what it is to have a cold last more than one day. You nip it in the bud before it really gets hold of the system. Claudius was properly sympathetic. Mrs. Wycherley must not, of course, dream of going out. The visit to Deepwater could easily be postponed until the morrow. But the good-natured lady would not hear of this. Why, she said, should 3 people sit indoors for one cold, or rather the beginning of a cold, on a glorious morning like this? If you don't mind conducting Angela alone and unchaperoned, I am sure you would take good care of her, and for that matter, I think she is quite capable of taking care of herself. I told her I should insist, and she's putting her hat on now. But won't you be wretchedly dull all alone? My dear Mr. Sandell, if I thought that I was spoiling everybody's pleasure, then I should indeed be dull. But I assure you, I have much to occupy me. I'm working for a bazaar. I don't know if you ever... At this moment Angela entered. She wore white muslin, and it was quite a new dress. "Mamma won't let me nurse her," she said, "and has turned me out of doors. I'm going back to live with Papa." Mrs. Wycherley smiled, protested, fluttered, fussed. There were a few moments of amiable and aimless small talk, and as much opposition to Mrs. Wycherley's plan as civility demanded. And then Claudius and Angela started out. "This is your own boat," said Angela as she stepped into the stern of it and took the lines. "Yes, it's mine. Why did you think so?" "I thought it looked too new for a hired boat, and the cushions are too good, and it's got several little treats in it that one does not get in a hired boat." They spoke further of the difficulty of steering with the sun blazing on the water, of dragonflies, and of certain popular beliefs as to the bad temper and physical strength of swans. And of all these they spoke with that appearance of great interest that one always shows when one is being more interested in something of which one is not speaking. After a while they came to a backwater and went down it. Here they were quite alone. The dragonflies flashed across the river over the floating water-lily leaves. The midges in fevered shoals danced out their day. From the high white road in the distance, where a man was driving cattle and having trouble with them, came the faint echo of an angry shout. In a shady place, with trees meeting over the water, Claudius drew the boat into the bank, and Angela, nestling more comfortably into the silken cushions, thanked him for having found so lovely a spot. They had both known, through all their impersonal talk, that the personal question was for them the inevitable question, that on that day, sooner or later, in one way or another, it would arise. "I've been thinking a good deal," said Angela suddenly, looking away from Claudius and over the water. "I was afraid so," said Claudius. "I was wrong, but I know it now, and I'm very sorry for it." "In what way wrong? I do not understand." "For telling you, even though you asked it, all that I told you on Tuesday night. I knew that you were sensitive, tender-hearted, that the story must hurt you. I knew that by telling you I was not materially benefited. The only thing that can be said for me is—" He paused. "Yes?" said Angela in a low voice. "Why should I not say it? I could not endure to be in a false position with you." A slight flush came and died in her cheeks. "And besides," he continued, "I think it was the first time in my life that I needed sympathy." "Why should tender-hearted people be cowards?" said Angela. "In order to give sympathy, one must first feel pain. But in giving it there is pleasure. The greater that pain, the greater that pleasure. No, you must not reproach yourself. I should be glad if you would tell me more, if there is any more. We shall soon be at the end of that story. Last night I laid awake an hour, and seemed to hear all the clocks in the world ticking out the minutes left to me. There is little that is new since I spoke to you that night on the heath, and what is new is very prosaic. A publisher has accepted my novel. Before I came to you this morning, telegrams passed between my broker and myself. I have sold my Martenhuis Deep. They were up again yesterday at a profit of £12,000. I could repay Dr. Lamb twofold, if there were the remotest chance that money would tempt him." "Your book accepted?" murmured Angela. "And fortune come to you, and all too late?" "If that were all," said Claudius passionately, "if that were only all." "Isn't it?" she said. "You know that it is not. You must know what I have no right to tell you, except it be the right of a dying man. It is the love which comes too late. It is that which hurts. Angela, I love you. I, who have no right to say it, I love you." "I think I knew," she said. She spoke with quiet serenity, but her bosom rose and fell more deeply and quickly. Her pathetic eyes looked fixed away from him. "And it all goes on," she said after a moment's silence. "The shadow of the clouds drifting over the water, and little bits of things floating downstream. And that thrush there, singing just the same. And in a few hours you will have gone away, and I shall not hear you speaking to me any more, and—" Just then she broke down. Suddenly she covered her face with her hands. "I can't bear it, Claudius," she sobbed. "I can't bear it." "Forgive me, dear Angela." She let her hands drop, looked at him with tears in her eyes, and spoke, catching her breath here and there. "But no, if you had not spoken, that would have been harder. Now there's happiness coming through it all." He was as one dazed. "It's so hard to believe," he said. "Do you mean that you care, that you love me?" "Yes, oh yes." She said it almost proudly, with her sad eyes still looking full into his. "Though I die tonight," he said, "I shall have seen paradise. Do you remember saying that?" "Yes, I remember. That was the first evening I met you, and loved you. Oh, Claudius, all my life through I must have been looking for you. Only 2 days more. I, too, I seem to hear all the clocks in the world ticking out the minutes. Have you no hope at all, dearest?" He smiled. "I have but to break my word, and I'm free." She shook her head. "You know," she said, "I could not ask that. Is there no other hope?" "So little," he said drearily, "that I had no right—" "Don't!" she broke in impetuously. "Don't say that any more. You must not reproach yourself. You have done right in telling me. I feel it, know it. It cannot go on to the conventional end. but it's good that you have loved me even this very little while." Away in the distance, a church clock chimed out the hour. Then near at hand they heard the regular turn of oars in the rowlocks. Another boat was approaching. Voices and laughter grew gradually more distinct. Claudius pushed out from the bank. They were not far now from the inn at Deepwater, and he rowed towards it in silence. Angela lay back on the cushions, watching him. Beyond the garden of the inn, with its sly, commonplace, sentimental arbours, was an old orchard. They had their coffee brought here after luncheon. Angela sat playing with her coffee-cup. Claudius, lying on the grass at her feet, looked up in her eyes and praised her. Their talk was enraptured, full of those endearing words and phrases that lovers use and the rest of the world derides. After a while they spoke of the past, each wanting to know what the other's life had been like. "Full of the smallest things," said Angela, until this. "Until I loved you," said Claudius, "my life was worthless. Not worth what Dr. Lamb gave me for it. Not worth anything." They praised love. Love was the light in life, the stars in the night, the scent in the flowers, the soul in the music. All the truisms come out new when one is living the truth of them. To the dying man, Tempest Fugit is no commonplace. As they rose at last to go homewards, Claudius took her by the hands and drew her towards him. She half whispered something. He could not hear the words. "I love you," he cried. "If you knew how I loved you, I love you." Her gentle voice came like an echo. He held her closely in his arms now. Her head fell backward. Her eyes fainted. Her breathing quickened. He kissed her beautiful mouth. Together, in silence, they passed back through the orchard, through the garden, to the inn and the river. In the boat, too, for some time they sat in silence. "If," said Claudius at last, by some means that I cannot foresee now, I can get back my liberty, I shall come back to you. I am bound to you. But you must not think yourself bound to me. You are free." She held her little hands together like a chained captive. "I shall never be free again," she said. "I would not be." "Will you come to me tonight on the heath?" said Claudius. "I will be by the white beeches, you remember, where I found you that night, when I told you my story, and wait for me there. The time is so short, and I must see you again before the day's over." "Yes," she said, "I will come to you, Claudius." Once that afternoon Angela had said, "I do not think we need tell any one about this. No one else could understand. Lovers love secrecy, and Claudius would fain have given in to her wishes, but he felt he had no right in this matter. "I am afraid," he said, "that you must tell your mother our secret, but not, of course, Dr. Lamb's." Perhaps no one could have understood. Certainly, when Angela tried to do as Claudius had said, poor Mrs. Wycherley was mystified extremely. She sympathized. She said that she could have wished for nothing better than an engagement between her daughter and Claudius Sandell, who was a kind and honorable gentleman, if Mrs. Wycherley had ever seen one. But was this an engagement? If not, what was it? Oh, couldn't Angela explain a little more? Angela, on the verge of tears, could not. Mrs. Wycherley thereupon roamed into a wild field of hypothetical explanations on her own account. Some of them sounded likely, some were very wild, and all were quite wrong. Then she became expostulatory. Until this obstacle, whatever it was removed, Angela ought really not to see Mr. Sandell. "Well, as you have promised, I shall let you go to-night just for 5 minutes. Or shall we say 4? Well, 5 then. But after that, no more. No more at all until he is free to go on as he ought to go on." "But, Mother," Angela pleaded, "you've told me that you like him and trust him. If I do not see him again after to-night, perhaps I shall never see him again at all, never, as long as I live. You can't understand. The difficulty is not any of the things you think, not anything he can escape or alter. If not tomorrow, let me see him on Saturday before he goes. It will only be like saying good-bye to a dying man. Oh, I will be good and do what you tell me, but I'm so unhappy." And here Angela, not ineffectively, though the poor child was not acting, burst into tears. Mrs. Wycherley was sure that she was more distressed than she could express. She blamed herself that it had ever come to this, and how, she asked, was she to know what to say, when she only wanted to act in the way that was best for Angela. What she said at last was that they would be back in London on Saturday, that Claudius might call on them in Erciston Square on Saturday evening, and Angela should be allowed to see him alone then. When they met on the heath that night, Angela told her sorrows breathlessly, and asked what was to be done. "I had meant to ask you that," he replied. "See, can you read this? I found it waiting for me when I got back this afternoon. It is from Lady Verrider." By the light of the wax match that Claudius held in his hand, Angela read the telegram. "Your father wires me nothing wrong with him, but he would like to see you at once. Do please go to him. Am sure it would be best." "What does it mean?" said Angela. "The telegram says that he is not ill." "It may mean reconciliation," said Claudius thoughtfully, "or it may mean that the spirits have advised Matilda Comby to send for me. It may mean anything." "Claudius, I think you must go to him." "Yes, I think so too, now. If I cannot be seeing you, I will go there. Indeed, if it does mean reconciliation, I shall be glad to go. I should love to be on good terms with him again before the end. But, Angela, to think that we have only 2 days left, and we are to lose almost the whole of them." Dear love! As best they could, they comforted each other, yet parted with heavy hearts. End of chapter 15. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 16 of the Octave of Claudius. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. The Octave of Claudius by Barry Payne, Chapter 16. That night, immediately after leaving Angela, Claudius took the train from Guilbridge to London, and then went on by the night mail north. It was a hideous journey. The man was in a fever and could not sleep. In following the Wycherleys to Guilbridge, he had acted as those weak fools act who shut their eyes and deceive themselves. It was a bitter reproach to one who had in him the makings of a strong man. He had before him horribly and vividly the certainty that he would lose his life, and that life, since now he knew that life meant love, was immeasurably valuable. And above reproaches, and above horror, came the exaltation of mutual love. Angela's words seemed to speak themselves again to him. The dawn, coming pale through the carriage windows, seemed to him symbolical of her farawayness. His life had been like a gray day, working and commonplace, and its sunset was like the gate of heaven, and the night was inevitable. It was little wonder that he could not sleep. A servant in livery was on the platform when he arrived, in a slow local train from the junction, and the carriage was waiting for him, although it had been too late for him to telegraph that he was coming. It was a wearisome drive to Sir Constantine's place. In the hall he found a servant whom he remembered, the old butler. "Yes, sir. Sir Constantine is in very good health, sir. He'd expected you'd come by this train. Well, this is a pleasure, if I may say so, sir." Claudius chatted with the old man for a minute or so. They had always been friends, and it is pleasant to be welcomed. "Well now, Gunning," he said, "what's the news here? How's Miss Cumby?" Gunning dropped his voice. "Gone, sir. Went Wednesday night, after telegrams had been comin' and goin'. Marchin' orders, I fancy. And if I might take the liberty, we're all of us, well, we can live through the loss of her. We'd a fire, too, last night, while you were in the train. But that you'll hear about, sir, but it's not for me to speak. Breakfast will be ready directly. But if you'd like to have your bath first—" Claudius had his bath and made his way into the dining-room. Gunning brought a message that Sir Constantine would be down directly, and Claudius was not to wait. Claudius was in love, but he was also physiologically hungry. He had scarcely begun breakfast when the door opened, and Sir Constantine, noticeably well-dressed, with a newspaper in his hand, sauntered into the room. Sir Constantine had the face of a dreamer, poetical eyes, and rather a weak chin. He had an erratic sense of humor. His forehead was developed in a way that showed he was not such a fool as his chin would have had you believe. He shook hands with Claudius, calmly and quietly, as if they had parted the night before. Sir Constantine had an admirable talent for ignoring anything which he wished to ignore, and it was very soon apparent that he intended to use it. "While you were asleep in the train, Claudius," he said, "we were having a little excitement here. A fire. That's why I'm late this morning." "Nothing serious, I hope, sir," said Claudius. He had been brought up to address his father in this old-fashioned way. "Just a cottage burned to the ground, and not insured. I dare say it won't ruin us, but still it's a loss, of course. But your private wire to the fire station in the town, for some reason or other, it wouldn't act. That's a pity. Who had the cottage?" "No one at the time. Up till the night before it had been occupied by a woman called Cumby. You know nothing about her. She did not arrive here until some time after you had left for your work." Claudius opened his eyes wider. Sir Constantine quietly repeated this pleasant fiction. Claudius smiled and accepted it. The past was to be ignored, or rather, it was to be altered, to suit the taste of Sir Constantine. He gave a little more information about Miss Cumby. He had thought her a deserving woman who had seen trouble, with some knowledge of philosophy, in which, as you know, my boy, I've always taken an interest. He was willing to own that he had been deceived. An anonymous letter had arrived. He had telegraphed and had received telegrams. It was a most deplorable and shocking case. He utterly and altogether declined to go into it, but he might say that the anonymous letter had stated the actual facts, and in consequence the woman had gone. He dwelt with an ill-concealed satisfaction on the fact that in the fire at the cottage the whole of the furniture assigned to Miss Cumby's use, and even the books, which Sir Constantine had lent her, were completely destroyed. He spoke of a poacher seen lurking about the grounds, but Claudius had little doubt who the incendiary was. After breakfast, Sir Constantine took Claudius round the stables. A pony he mentioned had been stolen by gypsies. Then they wandered out into the paddock. At the end of the paddock was a disused slate quarry, deeply excavated and fenced off some distance from its edge. Sir Constantine climbed over the fence, and Claudius followed. Under a tree, Claudius saw a neat little governess cart with a set of plated harness, the cushions, a rug, and a little clock lying in it. "What is that doing here, sir?" Claudius asked with some surprise. Sir Constantine chose to misunderstand the question. "What is that? Oh, that's the cart that Miss Cumby used to drive. He picked up the shafts. Neat little thing, isn't it? Runs so lightly." He pushed it from him. There was a loud crash from a projecting jagged ledge, and a splash in the deep water in the pit below. The cart had gone over. "Good heavens!" Claudius exclaimed. "Careless of me," said Sir Constantine. "Really very careless." He fumbled for his cigarette papers. "We'd better send a man to see after it," said Claudius. "Not worth while." They retraced their steps to the house. The fire, the theft of the pony, the accident to the cart were all perfectly obvious. Sir Constantine would not allow one trace of Miss Cumby to remain. "By the way," said Sir Constantine, "as that woman displeased me, it might be as well if her name were not mentioned. In fact, I utterly and altogether decline to have her name mentioned in my presence." "Very well, sir." "And now, what about yourself? You will be here sometimes, I hope." Then came rather a difficult part for Claudius. There was so little about himself that he could tell. It was unfortunate, but he would have to return to London almost at once. He was leaving England on Sunday. "You will not be away for long?" "I do not really know exactly. It does not depend entirely on me." "Yes, your work," said Sir Constantine vaguely. "A man ought to be able to support himself by his work. Even if it is not necessary, it increases his self-respect. I'm glad to see you a capable man. I reverence capacity. You used to have, I remember, a tendency towards writing." "I've written a novel," said Claudius. "It has been accepted and will be published, and that will be the end of it." "Let us hope not. From what I know of your abilities, speaking frankly, I do not think your novel will be either good enough or bad enough for a complete failure. But a novel! I could have wished it had been a philosophical work." "I have not the knowledge." "Nor I, nor I. But I'm taking a great interest in it. I've gone back to my Greek. Aristotle is very difficult. So is Plato. I employ the classical master at the grammar school here 3 evenings in a week. I also use translations. That is, I have arranged for the classical master and the translations. I only began on Wednesday, but yesterday, though I had other things to think about, I gave some hours to the subject, and I already have the idea. The Socratic Gospel, the Gospel according to Socrates. In that lies the only real consolation." He warmed to his newly acquired pet. "Not only for the man of education," he went on, "the Socratic Gospel is universal. The bricklayer may leave his crude Salvationism. The hysterical woman," he said it without the least sign of embarrassment, may leave her silly spiritualistic nonsense. The gospel, according to Socrates, is the gospel of the future. It may fall to my lot to present it in English in a popular form. It would be an honorable work. On the title page, The Gospel of Socrates, translated, arranged, and edited for the use of the English-speaking races by... And so he went on, galloping his latest conviction into the land of nowhere. It was half sad and half ridiculous. But the son had known the father for so long now that the exposition neither depressed him nor amused him. It was his father as he had always known him, and now once more his good friend. Sir Constantine showed very little curiosity. He took it for granted that Claudius would come to see him again in 2 or 3 months, or possibly later. Claudius did not undeceive him. That could be better done by letter, at the last moment. On the station platform, a few minutes before the train came in by which Claudius was to return, Sir Constantine remarked hesitatingly that Claudius looked well, fairly, only fairly, well-dressed but well-fed, comfortable. He was very pleased to see it. By this route he arrived at what he wanted to say. "But all the same, my boy, I don't want you to be absolutely dependent on your work, your novels, for the comforts and necessities of life. Now, I find from my bankers that there has been a very grave irregularity in paying you your allowance. In fact, for some little time it has not been paid. Even the best of banks seem to make silly mistakes and misinterpret orders sometimes. Now I must have my wishes carried out, and I have made this arrangement. I have made over to you the sum of £10,000. It's invested, and I shouldn't alter the investment if I were you. But the money is yours absolutely, and if you ever had any pressing need for a large sum, you could of course realize. The interest will be paid into your account at the bank. Strelin, old Strelin, arranged it for me. He thought it the best plan." Strelin was Sir Constantine's country solicitor, and his opinion of Sir Constantine's plans was generally complimentary. "Here's your train," the old man went on. "Now, take this." He drew an envelope from his pocket and handed it to Claudius. "It's the particulars about the money." "Certainly not. I absolutely and altogether decline to be thanked. Merely my duty, and at the same time my pleasure." He shook Claudius warmly by the hand, and without waiting a moment longer hurried from the station, as if escaping from the consequences of a shameful act. Claudius found in his travelling bag, placed there by his father's hand, a volume of Grote's History of Greece, with certain passages marked. On the flyleaf was scrawled an injunction to him to read the book on his journey and post it back when he arrived. End of Chapter 16. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 17 of the Octave of Claudius. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. The Octave of Claudius by Barry Payne. Chapter 17. Saturday morning was fortunately for Claudius full of business. There were arrangements to be made, bills to be settled, and a really good solicitor to be persuaded to do something in a hurry. And the really good dislike hurry. He had to call at the bank and at the publishers. He had a score of trifles that needed his attention. So far he had preserved appearances well. On his journey north and on his return he had spoken and acted in a normal way, had forgotten nothing, given no sign of absent-mindedness, allowed no railway porter or chance travelling companion even the vague idea that there must be something the matter. He had gone successfully through the ordeal of meeting with his father and parting from him. But this morning it was different. Every business act was a great effort to him. Continually he had to recall his thoughts, and to concentrate his attention. Sometimes he would find that he had forgotten to say something of importance, and sometimes that he had repeated some needless commonplace, a remark on the weather, for instance, 2 or 3 times. But the flicker of a suppressed smile on the face of the man who happened to be talking with him at the time gave him no annoyance. The same thing that made him capable of small mistakes made him incapable of small annoyances. The excitement overmastered him. The excitement of love returned, yet hopeless, of fortune gained, yet worthless, of life continued, yet worse than death, of fate laughing, and the end near. 2 letters had reached him that morning at his London hotel by the first post. One, how often he had read it, was from Angela. Early on Friday morning, Mrs. Wycherley had telegraphed to her husband, and he had come at once. First he had seen Mrs. Wycherley alone. Then he had called Angela down and taken her out in the garden with him. He had seemed serious, but not in the least angry with her. On the contrary, he had never been kinder. He had questioned her, but there had been some questions which she had to tell him she could not answer. Indeed, she had not told him very much. After that, he had left for London. Angela had heard him say, "I shall certainly call upon Lady Verrider this afternoon." She quoted another remark of his. "It's a case, I think, for a man of business and plain common sense, and I am that, and very little else." At the end, he had tried to cheer Angela up, and told her that all might be well. He could not say for certain, but he thought the case was not quite hopeless, if Claudius could be got to listen to reason. Her little budget of news told, poor child, somewhat incoherently, occupied by a little of her long letter. The rest was quite sacred and quite human, and to Claudius most lovely and priceless and sad. The second letter, which was from Mr. Wycherley, ran as follows: "My dear Mr. Sandell, I intend to call at your hotel tomorrow, Saturday afternoon at 5, and take my chance of finding you. I know that you will naturally be much occupied, but I hope you'll be able to spare a few minutes in which to see me. I'm far from thinking that you have acted, to say the least of it, with discretion, but I do not want you to suppose that I'm calling in order to blame you or oppose you. The happiness of my only child is very dear to me, and any obstacle to that must be removed, if I can remove it. Believe me, I am only anxious to secure what you yourself must wish. I may be able to help you, and I hope you will let me try. From the little that I have been able to learn, I think that my business experience may be of service to you." The letter presented Mr. Wycherley to Claudius as the very image of the completely kind father on the utterly wrong tack, but of course he determined to see him. He wished first to see Lady Verrider, but the business of the morning prolonged itself into the afternoon, and it was after 4 before he arrived at her house. Lady Verrider paced the room. She was beautifully dressed, and quite furious, angry, and affectionate by turns, and the more angry because she was really fond of him. He had to listen to tirades. "What did I tell you? What did I warn you? I knew what would happen, what was bound to happen, if you went to Guilbridge. Oh, I know that devout lover type so well. It's going to love in silence, and it never does. It's going to worship from afar, and it always insists on propinquity. It is determined to be content with very little, and it never is. And if it's good-looking, as I suppose you are, and takes trouble, as I know you did, it may manage to make some poor girl love it and confess her love. Then the devout lover raises his hat politely and says good morning, and how sorry he is that it can never be, and he had never dreamed that it would come to that, and he is not worthy, and so on. Then he walks off. Pretty figure, isn't he? My dear lady, I am not that cur exactly. I told Angela from the first that the rest of my life was not mine. Then the time was so short, just a few days. It did not seem possible that any harm could happen, Angela was, and is, so far beyond me that I did not suppose— no, you devout lovers never do suppose that any perfectly ordinary thing can possibly happen. But why did you say that you loved her? Why did you tell her?" "My God," said Claudius with sudden passion, "do you ask me that? Have you never been in love?" "Yes, I was in love with the man I married. That is one of the reasons why I am so sorry for the poor girls who are made to fall in love with the men that they can never marry." "I dare say," said Claudius, "that you will tell me that it is the usual formula of the devout lover. But I can only say again that I did not expect what happened." "Of course," Lady Verrider continued, "I know in my heart that you don't deserve what I say to you, but I am angry and miserable. You are not a cur. I almost wish you were. What I am afraid of in you is your silly, out-of-date, romantic, highfalutin chivalry. Nothing but that, I'm convinced, could have got you into your present impossible position. I have been talking to Mr. Wycherley, a very sensible little man. He quite agrees with me." There was a pause, and then Lady Verrider asked quickly, "You went to see your father. Are you reconciled?" "No formal reconciliation took place. The past was ignored. You know his way. But we're on the best of terms. He insisted on giving me money, 10,000. And you also made a small fortune by speculation, I am told." "Yes, I made some money." "And your novel has been accepted, and Angela would marry you. And just at this point you disappear, and will not explain why." "I cannot explain it to you. I have told Angela, and she will tell no one." "Will you tell me one little thing? You say that your life has been disposed of. To whom? Who is this mysterious man in the background? His name, please, just his real name and nothing more. Tell me that, and the rest I will manage for myself. I know you ask it from the kindest motives. I am ashamed not to be able to tell you. If the secret were all my own, it should be yours too, and at once. But it is not only mine. I cannot tell you." "Oh, I give it up. It's killing me, and I'm absolutely miserable." "I am sorry indeed," said Claudius, "that I should distress you in this way." She stood before the mantelpiece, moving little objects on it restlessly. "Mind you," she added suddenly, "you will find Mr. Wycherley far more determined." "That may be. I am to see him almost directly. I must be going." "He has certain rights now. You've given him those rights. Yes, I'm glad you told Angela, and you cannot get over them." "Dear Lady Verrider, don't speak as if I wanted to get over them. I'm not a natural martyr. I'm longing to be free and happy. My wishes are just the same as yours and Wycherley's. If, without knowing the circumstances, and I cannot tell him them, he can show me a possible solution, I shall welcome it." Then Claudius said good-bye. He assured Lady Verrider that he would do all he could, and reminded her that some unforeseen chance might possibly favour him. But she would not be assured. She had a presentiment, she said, that she would never see him again. Claudius found Mr. Wycherley at the hotel. "How is Angela?" Claudius asked eagerly. "She is very unhappy," the little man replied simply. He was rather nervous at first, observed that the rain still kept off, inquired as to the health of Sir Constantine, fidgeted with his hat. Then he put down the hat, seated himself, wiped his forehead, and plunged. "Now, Mr. Sandell, you know that I have seen my wife and daughter. Jessica is, you may have noticed it, a little inclined to be vague, if I may put it so. She never seems actually to know anything about anything. I'm not finding fault with her for it. You'll understand. It's in her nature, and we're none of us perfect. I mention it to account for any mistakes I have made in forming my idea of the situation. Angela is far more clear in her statements, but she will not go beyond a certain point. She could tell, but won't. My wife would, but can't. Will you let me question you somewhat plainly, that I may correct myself where I am wrong? Ask anything and plainly as you will. I will tell you all that I can. You love my daughter, and would marry her. Yes. The simple answer was as effective as a more fervent protest. But after tonight you cease to be your own master. Of the remainder of your life, some disposition was made before you met Angela. Yes. I've known young men, good fellows really, make for themselves unending trouble. Youth, hot blood, and ignorance. They do a deal of harm. Pardon me, but is there another woman in the case? No. Has there been some previous, nothing. I have never loved, nor ever shall love, anyone else. I believe you. Indeed, you tell me what I expected, but I wanted to be quite sure. That finishes with woman. We come to money. Claudius handed Mr. Wycherley some memoranda and letters, one dated that day from the bank. No, protested Mr. Wycherley. It's not necessary. I would rather, said Claudius. Mr. Wycherley examined, and his face fell. If all this money will not help, then the case is bad indeed. No amount of money could help. The case is bad indeed. I want you also to read this. It is my will by which I leave all unconditionally to Angela. My solicitors are also acting as my executors, and I am just returning it to them. Mr. Wycherley stared at the carpet. God help her, was all he said. I knew it was nothing, said Claudius after a pause. All that I can do now is nothing. I shall not, at least, die happily. Die? Exclaimed Mr. Wycherley suddenly. Then you expect to die? Is that so? Is it? I cannot tell you. But I think you have told me. You leave me to work in the dark. You won't show me the reason, the motive. If it had been woman, I could have helped you, for I was once young. If it had been money, I could have helped you, for I am now old. It seems that it's neither. But I have worked in the dark before. In the city, I needn't go into it, but I have had to play the game when I did not know what the game was or where it would end. But as I have gone on, I have found a glimmer here and a glimmer there, until at last there was light enough. I'm going to work in the dark now, for already, Mr. Sandell, I've seen the glimmer, just the faintest. Now, you said that I might question you. Tell me under what compulsion you agreed that within a few days you would sacrifice your life. I did not guess at the time. Claudius paused. Go on, said Mr. Wycherley excitedly. You say that you did not guess at the time that there was an actual peril of life, however you know it now? Go on. There was no compulsion whatever. I was broken down at that time, and did not think that my life could ever have any value for me. But why to this man? Why give it to him? Mr. Wycherley, it's no use, said Claudius. I beg you not to ask me any more questions. I've had no sleep, and I'm worn out. I can't think clearly, and I can't trust myself to talk. I'm so afraid of telling you things unintentionally, which I am bound in honor not to tell. Don't think me ungrateful. I am not that. You have been very kind to me, when you might with justice have been only very angry. Yes, said Mr. Wycherley, you look tired and ill. I had noticed that. I won't question you any further. On the contrary, instead of asking for an explanation, I will give you one. I'm nothing much, you know, only a businessman, but Angela is a good deal to me. I can't see the rest of her life spoiled, and I won't do it. Nor will I let you be murdered because of some sense of honor, which as a businessman I can't understand. You feel yourself bound by a contract of a nature which the law doesn't allow. I've not been angry with you, though you were in the wrong to go to Guilbridge in the first place. Once there, the rest was inevitable. Now you must not be angry with me if I should seem afterwards to have interfered with you, for I am going on working. How? In what way? It is my turn to say that I cannot tell you. Claudius thought for a few moments. You are justified, he said. Mr. Wycherley, there is one more thing to say. I must tell you how sorry I am. The worst that I have to bear is that Angela should suffer. I never dreamed that she would come to care for me. My days were so few. I thought the joy and the sorrow of it would be mine alone. And now, when I think of it, and how you and her mother love her, I see that I have done the worst thing I ever did in my life. I have done a terrible thing that will weigh me down to the end. Angela will not let me ask for forgiveness, and will not hear that there is anything to forgive. You know how much there is." "I won't say there's nothing to forgive," said Mr. Wycherley, and then very simply and kindly he held out his hand. "But it's all right, Claudius. I believe you're a good fellow. I couldn't have wished for a better for Angela. I should be a harder man than I am if I couldn't forgive you now. I see how you're placed. If you're to be saved, it must be in spite of yourself, and in spite of you I'm going on working. When you come tonight to say goodbye to Angela, remember that she takes things hard. Don't let her think that it's the last time, that she'll never see you again. You understand, of course." "Perfectly. Thank you. Thank you very much." It was arranged between them that Claudius was to call at Erciston Square at 9 o'clock that night. He was to see Angela alone, and only Angela. Mr. Wycherley was no sooner outside the hotel than his work began, and he was not, he thought, working so completely in the dark now. He remembered all that he had heard from his wife, from Angela, from Lady Verrider, from Claudius himself. He pieced his information together rapidly and formed his conjectures. The commissionaire called a cab for him. "Where to, sir?" the man asked. "Ludgate Circus," said Mr. Wycherley. From Ludgate Circus, Mr. Wycherley had not far to go to the office of Mr. Abraham Penny's detective agency. It was after 6 on Saturday night, but that office knows no hours. His business was simplicity itself. A young gentleman, description given, would arrive at Mr. Wycherley's house at 9 o'clock that night. He would leave it for some other house before 12, for he had to be at this other house by 12. Mr. Wycherley wished to know where this other house was, who its occupants were, and all that could be discovered about them, in fact. Mr. Wycherley would like a report to this effect to be on his breakfast table on Sunday morning, and would then send further instructions. Until these were received, a close watch by night and day was to be kept on that other house, and every movement of that young gentleman or of the occupants of the house was to be followed and reported to Mr. Wycherley at once, and Mr. Wycherley hoped that there would be no difficulty. "Difficulty?" said the assistant manager. "It's the ABC. We see the young gentleman, go into your house, and follow him when he comes out. You shall hear from us by 11 on Sunday morning, and anything that turns up further as the day goes on. You don't want the young gentleman or his companions to suspect they're shadowed, and you'd like the thing to be done thoroughly." "Quite so. Put your best men on to it, and don't spare expense. Want a check in advance, or a reference?" "Not from you, sir," said the assistant manager, and thereby showed his astuteness, and he showed it further by not putting his best men on to do work which the less good could do equally well. Mr. Wycherley was well pleased. He had common sense, and had proved it. As he entered the omnibus that would take him nearest to Erciston Square, he smiled upon his achievement. But common sense is not the gift of prophecy, and Mr. Wycherley little knew what the next few hours were to bring. "How is Angela?" he asked his wife as soon as he got home. Mrs. Wycherley was troubled and tremulous. "She doesn't cry any more, not since this morning. She seems to me to try to talk of other things and cheer me up, and there's nothing breaks me down more than that, coming from her. Takes nothing, a biscuit and a glass of wine that I insisted upon, but nothing more. So she won't be down to dinner. You saw Mr. Sandell? What have you done?" "I saw him, and I have done the right thing. Go and tell Angela that Claudius will come to say good-bye to her at 9 tonight, that I have been doing what I can, and have good reason to hope that Claudius will not be away long. But one moment before I go. What have you really done? Don't tell Angela, for she'd tell Claudius, and he must not know, or it would spoil all. Not a word. I've put it in the hands of Abraham Penny. Penny? What Penny? Private detective. Ah! And then was Mrs. Wycherley greatly comforted and refreshed, for, like most really good women, she had a faith in private detectives that never reasoned why, and could not be justified by facts. End of chapter 17. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 18 of the Octave of Claudius. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. The Octave of Claudius by Barry Payne. Chapter 18. There was a little back sitting-room in the house in Erciston Square, which had been known in the Wycherleys' earlier days as the library. Angela had objected that there were no books in it, and that therefore it was not a library. So Mrs. Wycherley, who could see a point very well when her attention was directed to it, decided that it should be called the breakfast room, and issued a solemn kitchen decree to that effect. There were relapses into the use of the word library on the part of the housemaid, a creature of habit. Mrs. Wycherley took a strong line, and the weeping maiden obtained a fixed idea that the use of the word library was indecent. So the breakfast room triumphed, and was securely established. Nobody ever breakfasted there, of course. It was in this room, lit by 2 red-shaded candles on the mantelpiece, that Claudius said good-bye to Angela. The dim rose light was kind to her pale face. Claudius had no longer any hope at all in his own heart. Mr. Wycherley might attempt something. It did not much matter what he attempted. Claudius knew that Dr. Lamb would be clever enough to foresee that some such attempt might be made, and clever enough to checkmate it. Yet he spoke to Angela as if he would come back, perhaps, and she too spoke as one who hoped. Then, at times, a hard look of horror came into her soft eyes, and both were very careful not to raise the question of the purpose for which Dr. Gabriel Lamb needed Claudius Sandell. "Remember," said Claudius, "that as long as I live, I shall always be loving you." "But not to hear you say it any more," cried Angela. "If that should be—" "It can't be. It can't end like this. Oh, Claudius, dear love, what shall I do? Tell me what I should do. How shall I wait for you?" Mrs. Wycherley had quite realized that this was an emotional hour in her house, and that for the sake of others she must bear up. To that end she took a glass of cocoa wine, and found it a broken reed. The poor, silly, affectionate woman loved her beautiful daughter so dearly that the thought of Angela's unhappiness made composure impossible. She was in her bedroom now, with her cap off, all sobs and sal volatile, the undignified love as much as the dignified. This idea of an emotional hour, this sense that there was sorrow in the house, had even permeated into the basement. Cook sniffed. The housemaid, the one who had never said library, now observed, "It's my Sunday out tomorrow, but I shan't take it." A dark saying, a vague, well-meant effort to get into keeping with the general atmosphere. Mr. Wycherley sat bolt upright in a straight-backed chair in the drawing-room. He held the Times in his hands, and thought he was reading it, and his face was solemn. He was ready, ready and waiting. He would hear the breakfast-room door open and shut, and the front door open and shut, and the carriage drive away. And at that moment he would emerge with a most cheerful smile, and take the broken, crying Angela into his arms, and he would say, "Don't fret, Angela. It's all right. I couldn't tell you before, but I have taken this in hand myself. I have. Tomorrow morning you shall have news of Claudius. I promise it. I absolutely promise it." That would surely do some good. Her parents had entrusted Angela with comforting messages for Claudius, and with their farewells the messages were easily delivered. The rest was difficult. "And as they will not see you tonight, and it may be long before they see you again, they asked me to say, 'Oh, Claudius, I don't want to say good-bye.'" Her breast heaved, and her lips trembled. Claudius drew her to him, and kissed her again and again. Neither of them spoke any more now, until the moment when Claudius left the house. He could hardly see, his head swam, he staggered like a man that has been drugged. Hardly had he flung himself back in his carriage before he fell asleep. Nature was exhausted. He did not wake until the carriage entered the drive before Dr. Lamb's house. Waking, he wondered where he was, for he had dreamed that he was back at home. Then he remembered. He pulled out his watch and glanced at the time. It still wanted 10 minutes to 12. He got out, and just as he was on the point of ringing the bell, paused, changed his mind, and turned around. "You can put my portmanteau down," he said. "You needn't wait." "Very good, sir," the man replied. There were still a few minutes of freedom left. Claudius clung to them. The coachman hesitated before driving off. Claudius had been very liberal. After all, it might be as well to mention what he had noticed. "I beg your pardon," he said, "but I'm not sure if you know we've been followed." "Followed?" "Yes, sir. I noticed a hansom hanging about when I was waiting in Erciston Square. As soon as I drove off, the cab followed. It kept behind me all the way, and when I turned in here, went on a few yards and then stopped. It's there now." "Any one in the cab?" "Two men, sir. I only got a glimpse. Common-looking they seemed." "Thanks. You were quite right to tell me, though I don't know that it's of much importance." The carriage drove off. Claudius stood beside his luggage with his watch in his hand. After all, then, he supposed, Dr. Lamb had not trusted him, and had put detectives on to follow him. The black shrubberies stood out clear against the pale sky. A breath of wind woke and rustled and fell again. All was absolutely still. In a moment Claudius put his watch back in his pocket and rang the bell. The sound spoke out resonant far back in the house, and immediately the door opened. Almost before the bell sounded, it was opened slowly and not to the full extent, not as Francis opened it. Mrs. Lamb stood there. She was barefooted and in her nightdress. Her hair hung loose about her shoulders. Her eyes were wild and roaming. She spoke in a horrible whisper. "I've been waiting behind the door for you. I got up and crept out, and they never knew." She shivered in the chill night air. Behind her was a chaos of packing cases. The carpets were up in the hall and on the stairs. The house looked naked. A gas jet flared without a globe. "Mrs. Lamb," Claudius began. He was going to persuade her to go in. Poor, mad woman! But she would not let him speak. "There is no time. Listen quickly, before they come and take me. I have been sent by Heaven to save you. You are to go away at once, and you must never come here again." She pointed to the passage that led to the study and laboratory. Gabriel's in there. Not the angel Gabriel, but the devil Gabriel. He's getting ready to kill you, sharpening knives. Every night I can hear him sharpen knives, though he does not want me to hear. Always sharpening knives. It goes like this. Brrr, brrr. She made a hideous, guttural imitation of the sound of a grindstone. At the same moment a door opened, and a woman in a plaid dressing-gown came out. She had a cloak over one arm, and she said quietly, "Mrs. Lamb, you must come back to bed." Hilda Lamb flung herself down on the floor of the hall, kicking and screaming. The nurse was a big woman, with a not unkindly face. She would not let Claudius help her, and indeed she needed no help. Her strength was enormous. She wrapped Mrs. Lamb in the cloak, lifted her, and carried her off. Then Claudius saw that the servant Francis was standing waiting at the further end of the hall. He now came forward, greeted Claudius respectfully, and began to carry in the luggage. "Dr. Lamb is in the study, sir," he said. "My dear Sandell," said the doctor cordially, coming forward as Sandell entered, "welcome to a half-empty and exceedingly uncomfortable home. I trust that you have been enjoying yourself in your absence." Claudius shook hands mechanically, thanked him mechanically, and sat down. "The octave is over. Lusisti satis. How does it go? Tempus abire tibi est. You will notice the preparations for departure everywhere here. Indeed, had all been well, we should have gone aboard the yacht on Sunday afternoon. But there has been a sudden change in my wife's mental condition. I'm afraid that when you came in just now, you heard I saw Mrs. Lamb. The nurse took her back into her room. Believe me, I am very sorry." Well, this change, though not uninteresting from one point of view, is of course exceedingly sad, and it has altered my plans slightly. My wife cannot possibly come with us now, and I have not yet finished the arrangements for her remaining in England. It may be Monday before we can start. Where are we going? Sandell, I own you now. I do not want to insist on that ownership more than is necessary for my purpose, and I cannot bring myself to give you an order like a servant, but I ask you for your own sake not to put questions to me about the future. Do not ask what I'm going to do with you. Sandell looked the doctor straight into the eyes. "I know very well what you're going to do with me," he said. "You believe," said the doctor, "that I intend to use you for the subject of experiment, and yet you keep your word. Well, I was sure you would." "You were sure?" Claudius said. "Yet I have been followed by your detectives tonight right up to your house." "My good Sandell, I have never employed a private detective in my life. I should think it dishonorable, and it has the additional disadvantage of being almost always useless. They are far from clever, that class, as a rule. At the same time, I can readily believe that you were followed here, and that you're being shadowed now. I can believe that there may be someone in London who has sufficient interest in you to be suspicious of your mysterious disappearance at a time when I understand you have every reason for not disappearing. Is that not so?" Claudius remembered that Mr. Wycherley had said that he would work on his own account and in the dark. He saw it all now. "I think you're right. I did you an injustice. I believe I know now who sent them. I have no doubt he believed he was acting in my interest, but it was done without my knowledge and authority. I should not have thought that I had any right to interfere with you in that way. Shall I tell you who I think sent them?" "No," said the doctor. "I don't think his name would interest me. He can do nothing, of course. His very smart people will hardly come aboard my yacht. They're amusing to watch for a short time, but I don't propose to allow them to take a voyage with me. Sandell," the doctor added, after a pause in which Claudius had not replied to him, You look very tired and broken down. You are also very depressed. I will not keep you here much longer, for you need sleep. But there's one thing I want to say. You have done me one injustice tonight, perfectly trivial as it happened, and I am afraid that you also do me another injustice. You doubt my humanity. There was a time when you regarded me as a good Samaritan. You now regard me as a murdering devil. The reaction has set in, and possibly it has been assisted by the chatter of that mad woman. I heard her talking to you. Now I cannot let you suspect my humanity, and partly for that reason, and partly because I really trust you, I will change my mind and tell you what I have arranged. You are, of course, to be the subject of experiment. Claudius Sandell looked steadily and contemptuously at the doctor. I do not mean it in any offensive sense, the doctor continued, when I say that you are of no practical use to me for any other purpose. I value your good opinion, as I am now showing, and have always found you a most pleasant and interesting companion. If I were not yours absolutely, and had any right to suggest, I should suggest we pass over this part. My dear fellow, do not be so humble or so bad-tempered. I'm not Legree in Uncle Tom's Cabin. You can suggest anything you like, and be sure that your suggestions will always be considered with respect, and adopted whenever it is possible. I do not bask and revel in villainy, and for the purposes of melodrama, I am useless. Your attitude towards me hurts me. For days and nights I have been planning how to make everything as easy as possible for you. Shall we pass over that also? Certainly, in one moment. I want to tell you how things stand. When the time comes, I shall ask you to allow me to administer an anesthetic. After a time, you will regain consciousness. Then from 30 to 50 minutes you will suffer. The anesthetic will be administered again immediately. The doctor paused. And when I regain consciousness the second time, the doctor lit a cigar, blew out the match, and flung it into the grate. You will not regain consciousness a second time. That will be, in fact, that will be all. That is why you're leaving England? The doctor shrugged his shoulders. There is no privacy in England, he said. But I ask you to notice that the very most you have to fear is 50 seconds of suffering. Probably not acute. All the lurid pictures that your imagination may have conjured up, or my wife and her madness may have depicted, may be dismissed from your mind. I am emphatically a humane man. If it were not for my humanity, for my broad love of the race, for my infinite longing that some future generation might be born not under the curse which weighs us down, but free and masters of their fate, I would not even ask you for that little thing, your life. Again, Claudius made no reply. Until that moment comes, when I begin the experiment, your comfort shall be my first consideration. No indignity shall be put upon you, except for that one purpose, and what is connected with it. You are free. I have a considerable fortune, said Claudius. I am afraid, said the doctor, that I cannot consent to accept gratuities. You have already told me that money was of no consideration with you. I was not intending to repeat my offer to buy myself from you. I wanted to ask if I were free to dispose of my money now and to will it after my death as I wish. Absolutely, perfectly free. And I may write letters? Certainly, any letters which do not prejudice my main purpose. After we leave England, you will omit the address, of course. Thank you, said Claudius. I have only one more question. Is there any consideration whatever which would induce you to terminate our agreement? Any consideration apart from money? I had thought that you would be likely to ask the question, and I have no objection to it. My answer is none. Absolutely none. At that moment Francis entered. The nurse would like to speak to you for a moment, sir. Excuse me, said the doctor, and went out. Claudius leant forward, with his head in his hands. He felt how easy it would be to fall asleep and to forget. In a moment or two the doctor returned. "The nurse," he said, "seems to think that someone should sit up with my wife tonight. It cannot be done. The nurse has not been to bed for 2 nights, and it would be hazardous to keep her up a 3rd night, unless it were absolutely necessary, and I do not think it is. Fortunately, I have to be up all night myself. I have something in the laboratory which requires watching, and I shall be here until 6. With the door open, I shall hear any sound. My wife sleeps downstairs now, you know." "Yes," said Claudius, hardly conscious of what had been said. "Yes, it is her idea that her dead baby crawls about upstairs and would disturb her rest. At any rate, she will not sleep upstairs." Claudius rose from his chair. "May I go to bed now?" he said. "I'm so tired that I'm not very good company." "Certainly. I hope you'll find your room comfortable. Francis will get anything you want. Whiskey and soda before you go? No? Ah, Claudius, I'm sorry I can't give you my philosophy, and I won't insult you by trying. Everybody has the philosophy which is suitable to the situation of somebody else. My philosophy is the very thing for a man in your situation. Well, well, good night. May I make one request? Again, this Legree business. Do please ask for anything you want," said the doctor a little irritably. "I want you to begin this experiment as soon as possible. To wait for it, that is hard to do." "Be assured," smiled the doctor suavely, "that I also am impatient. Good night again. Sleep well, and breakfast just when you happen to feel like it." Claudius left the room and went upstairs without a word. The doctor went on composedly with his work, and 2 hours slipped by. He had grown drowsy, and leaning forward with his head on his arms, fell into a doze. He often found that half an hour's sleep, snatched in this way, made a great difference to him, and sent him back to his work as fresh and energetic as ever. And as he slept, pit-pat, pit-pat, across the stone floor of the hall came the sound of naked feet. Past the bare hall, where the windows had stared like lidless eyes since the curtains were packed away, and unfaded patches stood where pictures had been, and the naked gaslight flared. Past the hall and down the passage came Hilda Lamb, quiet and cunning as a cat, with all hell awake in her mad eyes. She opened the study door softly. She smiled when she saw that the doctor was asleep. Without a sound, she passed through into the laboratory and switched on the electric light. She opened the big mahogany case of instruments and was careful not to let the click of steel be heard. She took what she wanted, switched off the light, and came back into the studio again. The bright edge of the thing she held in her hand attracted her attention. "Brrr, brrr, brrr," she said in her throat, imitating the sound of the grindstone. Dr. Lamb began to move his head. In a moment she flung herself upon him, and thrust and hacked and pulled. A storm came into the dream that Claudius dreamed that night. The forked lightning split the sky. The thunder cracked and roared. Below were people with white, frightened faces, a dense mass of people, all looking upward. They began to howl with terror, waving their arms. The dream suddenly ceased, and Claudius was awake. He was awake, and the room was filled with smoke. Someone was knocking violently at the door and crying to him to get up. "Fire! Fire!" And someone outside in the garden was singing. A poor mad woman that had been rescued from the merciful fire. The servants of the house watched her in awestruck silence as she was dragged away, ceasing her singing from time to time and fighting hard to get back to the flames. The fire had broken out in the annex, in the doctor's study. This was completely wrecked before the arrival of the engines. The main body of the building was damaged, but not ruined. In the gray early dawn, the police on watch talked confidently among themselves. "I saw her myself," said one of them, "and there was blood both on her hands and face. It'll be Broadmoor." At a little distance from the house, Claudius stood alone on the road and looked towards London. A four-wheeled cab lumbered slowly up, and Francis, who had gone to Wimbledon to order it, jumped down from the box. "It's the best they can do, sir." "Thanks," said Claudius, as he got in. "It'll do very well. Tell him to drive as quickly as he can." "Yes, sir." "Where to, sir?" "Erciston Square." Francis shut the carriage door. "Erciston Square," he echoed, as he seated himself beside the driver again. End of chapter 18. Recording by John Brandon. End of the Octave of Claudius by Barry Payne.